Good evening. Today is Tuesday, March the 12th, and the time is 6:30 p.m., and I'd like to call this regular meeting of the Planning and Zoning Commission to order. May I have a roll call, please?
Delory,
Here.
Mata,
Here.
Stiegel,
Here.
Onken,
Here?
Shield, here, James, Serrato.
Here.
Perfect, thank you. Item number 2, approval of minutes. Item 2.1, approval of the Planning and Zoning Commission February 13th, 2024 regular meeting minutes. We need a motion and a second.
Motion to approve.
Okay.
Second.
We have a motioner from Commissioner Stiegel and a second from Commissioner Serrato. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 All opposed, say nay. Great, motion carries. Item number 3, citizen comment period. The Planning and Zoning Commission welcomes comments from citizens early in the agenda of regular meetings. Speakers are provided with an opportunity to speak during this time period on any agenda item or any other matter concerning city business, and they must observe the 3-minute time limit. At this time, I will open citizen comments. No? Okay. Then we'll close those. Thank you. Item number 4, consider impossible action. Item 4.1, consider a request to construct an approximately 4,365 square foot bank located at 19019 IH 35. Frost Bank Conditional Use Permit, CUP-24-0100. Ms. Sharp.
Kayla Sharp, City Planner for the record. So we have a conditional use permit for the building materials within the I-35 overlay. This is for a proposed frost bank. This is in the Amberwood Ranch development, and the materials consist primarily of stone and stucco with appropriate architectural features to accent the building. So the kind of grayish material is the stone, and then the more tan is stucco. I know it's a little bit hard to differentiate there. Then you have your dumpster enclosure that's also masonry. So for this one, it is about 70%. Overall, it meets the 90% masonry. There's a little bit more stucco, but it still falls within that detail application. So this one is compliant with the I-35 overlay. Here is the site plan. It is the top right pad site at the intersection of I-35 and Amberwood North. And here is the landscape plan, which is compliant with the I-35 overlay. So this one is compliant, and we do recommend approval. Do you have any questions?
Michelle.
No
Oh,
questions.
I thought you were raising your hand. Never
No, I
mind.
was moving the mic. Sorry.
Okay. I guess there are no questions for you today on that one.
I'd like to make a motion to approve.
Okay.
Second it.
We have a motion to approve item 4.1 from Commissioner Shield and a second by Commissioner Mata. Is there any discussion on that before we vote? Okay. All those in favor of approving 4.1, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say nay. Perfect. Motion carries. Thank you. Item 4.2, consider and make a recommendation to City Council regarding a request by Mackenzie Aday on behalf of KDW Holdings LLC for a conditional use permit for a medical office use pursuant to the Calterra Capital Partners LLC development agreement for property located at 2220 Kohler's Crossing, Hays County, Texas 78640, CUP-24-0101. There is a public hearing for this item, so I will go ahead and open that now at 6:35 p.m. I will close it now at 6:35 p.m. Ms. Sharp.
All right, Kayla Sharp, City Planner for the record. So we have another conditional use permit for you. This one is actually for the use, not for materials. So this one is, if you'll remember previously back in January, y'all approved a CUP for the materials on this one as a shell building. They are now wanting to permit this for medical use, which per the Calterra Development Agreement requires a conditional use permit. So this will be about a 7,200 square feet building at the corner of Kyle Crossing and Kohler's Crossing. So the site is zoned retail services, which generally allows medical office use. However, as I stated earlier, per the Calterra Development Agreement, this one will require a conditional use permit for the medical office use. And then we're about to get into a lot of criteria for what it has to meet in order to be given the conditional use permit. So it is also, was in the backup material, but generally, is it consistent with the comprehensive plan? Does it comply with other requirements of the zoning ordinance? Is there adequate land area for the proposed use and everything associated with that? Will it create any adverse impacts upon neighboring properties for, noxious odors, things like that, or hours of operation? And then whether the proposed use is compatible with adjacent properties. So there's a lot on there. And then there are adequate utilities to the site. They have an approved site plan for their shell building, so there are adequate means of ingress and egress. And then the last one is whether the proposed use is overrepresented within or near to the community. And so just to kind of give y'all an idea, we have a map here showing the other medical uses. This is basically a half-mile buffer, so you can kind of see to the south. There weren't any within that half mile, so we shifted it up a little bit. There are 3, and none of them are dental offices, which this one would be a dental office. Well, one of them is a dental office, my apologies. So there's New Spine Chiropractic, that's just right across the street, and then Carbon Health, and then Aspen Dental is up at the north end of the Dry River District. So those are the only 3 medical uses within a half mile of this property. And just as a reminder, here are the renderings, site plan, landscape plan. So staff has found that this request is reasonable and is compliant with the criteria shown, and we recommend that the Planning and Zoning Commission recommend approval to City Council. So this one will go to City Council next week with y'all's recommendation. Any questions?
Yes, Commissioner Shield.
Okay, so what part of the development agreement does this not comply with?
It does comply with the development agreement.
Oh, okay, I thought that's why we were doing this, why it needed the conditional use.
No, so the conditional use permit states that in order to have certain uses, there's a list of, 5 or 6 uses that state they are allowed with a conditional use permit. So in order to have the use, they need a conditional use permit, but it is otherwise allowed. And based on staff's review of the criteria that was listed, we believe it meets the criteria needed to be granted as a
Okay.
conditional use permit.
I misread that, sorry.
No worries.
Madam Chairman, I'd like to address Commissioner Shield. There had been confusion from that meeting because really they could have wrapped this all up in one package back then and
Okay.
had not.
Okay.
So that's, I think, the thing we would stumble over.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for staff? Okay, so we would need a motion to take action on this item.
I'll make a motion to approve.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion from Commissioner Shield and a second by Commissioner Stiegel to recommend approval of item 4.2. Is there any discussion on that motion? Okay, all those in favor of approving 4.2, or recommending approval of 4.2, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. Okay, motion carries. Item 4.3, consider approval and make a recommendation to City Council regarding proposed landscape code amendments per Chapter 54 of the City of Kyle Code of Ordinances. There's a public hearing for this item as well, so I'll open that now at 6:40 Nobody? Okay, so we'll close that at 6:40. Mr. Atkinson.
Will Atkinson, for the record, Director of Planning. So before you, we have another amendment to Chapter 54, which is our landscape code. Back in September of '23, City Council, following our July update of the code, wanted to make this, wrap it up a little bit tighter, if you will. There's a lot of discussion about how we can work to incentivize or require xeriscaping. The July code primarily focused on encouraging it and allowed for expanded use of xeriscaping, and also with updated fence and screening requirements. So there's two components to what you see tonight. This is the first of two items being brought forward to y'all. So the first one is they wanted the update for the code, and they also wanted to start working on a program that y'all had input on for incentivizing xeriscaping where we can't otherwise require it from let's say if it's a rainwater barrel, or if we want people to replace their existing landscaping, how do we get them to the table on that kind of stuff? And that second part will come at a later date because we're still doing our research on that part. The proposed amendments, adding reference to the Austin Grow Green Guide for required plantings, specifically not requiring St. Augustine grass. We wanted to make sure that that was specifically in there, even though we are wanting to adopt the Austin Grow Green Guide, because we want it to be very clear that we're looking for, if you're going to have sod, it's going to be drought-resistant native species. But we're going to require xeriscaping in all zoning districts, requiring a greater mix of species when you are planting, updating and including pruning allowances for existing trees and other shrubbery, and then making our trunk diameter when it comes to specimen trees more specific to the specific species of trees, and not just a blanket 24 inches and above, right? And then adding oak wilt for requirements and protection, and also adding a specimen tree protection for specifically juniper ash for endangered species purposes. Generally, juniper ash is an exempt species from tree protection, but there are instances where it should be protected, and when you want to be cognizant of that as well when it comes to protection of the golden-cheeked warbler. Here are a quick Google search for Central Texas xeriscaping examples. The two images on the left are more likely to what you would see in the hill country. They have a more semi-arid kind of feel to them. The two images on the right are probably more towards the east side of Kyle, more Blackland Prairie, and more smaller homes, smaller lots perspective. Both of them can be accomplished in either way, but the idea is to incorporate xeriscaping in an appropriate manner for the area of the city that it's in, which the Grow Green Guide does a fantastic job about. So also included as backup material, we have the proposed changes to the existing code that are strike throughs and also underlined what we want to change. And so the couple options are to recommend approval as presented by staff, or approve amendments with recommended changes. And that's it in a nutshell, but I'm quite certain y'all will probably have some questions.
Okay, does anyone have questions?
Madam Chair.
Yes, Vice Chair Delory.
Mr. Atkinson, first off, on just a grammatical thing, there's an early statement that has your position, I think, as planning and it's not your current title, planning director. And that's corrected in the first instance. There's a number of other instances where it has your title incorrect. So we need to do a find and replace for those other ones. I want to inquire a little bit about a mandatory xeriscaping. So that looks like the language has changed from may be allowed is required. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So And that's for all zoning. So,
Yes, sir.
But then there's also talk about turf. So how is this going to be applied? How are we going to apply this? Let's start off with detached family zones, like single-family dwellings. How are we going to apply this mandatory xeriscaping if turf grass is still allowed? I don't see how we're going to apply it.
So xeriscaping is not necessarily river rock and agave plants and cactuses and related stuff like that. That can be a component of it. But xeriscaping is primarily requiring drought-resistant native species to the area, which use low water usage. There might be a little bit of uptick at the beginning when you plant it to get it established. But for example, for turf grass, you can have buffalo grass, which contributes a very nice, once it's established, a very nice cover and has very deep roots compared to St. Augustine, which we don't want anymore, which has shallow roots and uses a high amount of water. Zoyosa is also another good example. It's a little bit less expensive typically than buffalo grass as well. So there's options, and we do limit the maximum amount of aggregate, which is what you see on the screen there, to 25% of the required landscaping, because what we don't want to see is a front yard full of, or the entire lot that's not covered in concrete, full of river rock. We want to see a mix. We want to see, we want the kids to have a play area in the backyard. We want some shade trees. We want some nice flowering shrubs. You can have a cactus or two, that's fine. You can have a little bit of area. Maybe you have a little dry stream bed or something like that for an accent feature. So does that cover your?
It's just that when we require people to do something, they always want to have clear direction on what that can be.
Yes, sir.
So, the questions will start like, how much turf can I have and how much xeriscape? We've got the rock covered. We can have a maximum of 25% rock. But I'm just wondering if it's just going to lead to more questions about, well, if I have to have xeriscaping.
Understood, and we receive questions like this all the time internally when there's someone wanting, whether it's a homeowner or there's a commercial project coming in, we have requirements already in code where, for example, a single-family house, you have to have 2 trees and 6 shrubs on site, and you have to have a minimum allowance of covering on the ground before you even get your there's no COs for residential permits, but before you're allowed to move in, before we clear all comments on the inspections, largely to prevent erosion, but also as a double whammy to have appropriate landscaping as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
So with xeriscaping, like maybe including sort of an attachment to the code, so where people can see, like, because people hear xeriscaping, they oh, no, it's just rocks. Like, no, I mean, yeah, like you mentioned, it could be vegetation, mixed shrubs, whatever vegetative cover, but having that an attachment to this, so people can see that versus having to go into the guide. But if it's already included in the code, anything that makes it easier to people, for residents or developers to adhere to.
Like the Grow Green Guide from Austin?
Yeah, but having that as part of the,
As an example that
Yeah.
they can pull from.
Mhm.
So the thing that we have to be careful with is if we incorporate, so generally we have the Grow Green Guide as amended. That's what we're stating in there. So that way allows, by default, if the city of Austin updates the Grow Green Guide, it automatically updates on our end. So what we have to be careful about when we add an attachment like that, generally on our website, we have to make sure we're staying abreast of when it's being updated accordingly. And so it's probably best if that specific request is not in the code, but we could have it as an attachment on our website that people can reference, which is right.
Or an appendix to the link.
And then a link to it, or
Yeah.
yeah. But sometimes links change too, so we have to be
that's
careful.
Right.
So for the same context.
Something, so when you put it out there, it's just like, we do guidance.
Mhm.
Give a template, like, makes it really easy. Oh, okay. Instead of having people call with questions like, hey, if it's in there.
Mhm.
The point is just
Understood. We wanted to really give ourselves teeth to be able to enforce it, but also to be at the same time provide flexibility for people wanting to get creative in the design of their landscaping as well, if you will.
Maybe like some sort of workshop then, you know, because I mean, if summer's gonna be coming around, well, there's spring right now, so everybody's, you know, everybody's at Home Depot or Lowe's or nursery, oh, I gotta do this, I gotta do that. But, hey, instead of spending all that money on exotics, why don't you spend your money on, you know, native vegetation, you know, making brook plants, kind of doing something that you really would. And then the other question is, so, you know, there's a lot of homes in Kyle that have St. Augustine. What if they decide, hey, I want to replace, is there some sort of incentive that, like, if you replace your St. Augustine with native vegetation, I mean, besides just doing the right thing, is there an incentive for homeowners to do that?
Not yet. That'll be the second. This is part one, and part two is going to be working. We're going to bring some ideas to y'all for programs that have been successful or examples of it. There's some for the city of Austin. San Antonio has some as well. And so that way we can kind of look at it together as a group per council's direction and start looking through it and see what we want to emulate. The idea is, in my opinion, I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel. So if we find a program that's really successful, we should go for it. So that's the goal.
Question, excuse me. If I can recall from the document, there's a position, a developer must have somebody take on the position or the title, the responsibility of being a tree supervisor?
Yes, for the developer would, yes.
Why not have just a supervisor of essentially the entire landscape, the trees and the landscape, so that you have somebody that's on point, in charge, knows what the expectations are, and can implement that both for the city's sake and for the developer?
That's generally how it works by default, your idea. But if that's an edit that y'all want to make a recommendation to just tweak a little bit, by all means.
Yes, it maybe doesn't change it so much for you. I hope at least in a negative direction, but perhaps a change would be useful in terms of mindset, that there is actually somebody on that side of the line that's actually responsible for paying attention to the city code. And we can hold it accountable much more easily. So I would suggest that change at the point where it's irrelevant to be made.
I have several, sorry.
Okay.
Okay. Just highlighting. All right, starting with the synthetic plants for the artificial turf. We say that may only be utilized in commercial, multifamily, or mixed-use developments. Why not residential?
Bear with me.
It's top of page 4.
I'm trying to think back to when we drafted the first one, but Jason might be able to respond a little bit better than I can on this aspect.
The reason for that is it doesn't actually prohibit anybody from adding turf to their residential properties. You have to keep in mind that is a section under required landscaping. So the portion of your front house from the front wall plane to the front yard is required to have grass, natural vegetation. But that would not prohibit someone in the backyard if they wanted to do some turf or anything like that. At that point, we would just have to do a review of the type of product they're using. Each product has its own type of impermeability, and so generally subdivisions are constructed with drainage infrastructure that accounts for about 50% impervious cover on a site. So if people are getting kind of really out of hand on that and doing their whole yards, it could affect the drainage situation of the subdivision as a whole. So that's why it's kind of written the way it is. But it would not prohibit it. It just wouldn't be allowed in the required landscaping. Commercial's a little bit different because of just the way the projects are laid out. And so that's why we allowed that in that area, just not on residential.
And the reason I ask this is because in our neighborhood, we did put artificial turf down in our park area, and we had several homeowners who were saying, well, if the HOA can do it, why can't I? And so that's why I kind of asked
And
that a bit.
HOAs will be somewhat different from our regulations. Cities don't enforce those HOAs, so there could be some conflicts within the code because every HOA is a little bit different.
Okay, all right. Then, so the way the xeriscaping states is, yes, we can only be limited on the Riverwalk for 25%. So technically, their entire front yard can be mulched with drought-resistant plants with the appropriate irrigation. There's no percentage of the yard, a minimum or a maximum percentage for just xeriscaping, correct? So,
There is not a maximum for percentage for xeriscaping because the entire thing, you're required to have xeriscaping. But we want
I'm
to provide.
talking about residential here, yeah.
Yes,
Okay,
everybody.
all right,
And so it does need to be designed appropriately. You do want to have, in most cases, you do want to have mulch underneath the plantings so it can hold water in from a layering perspective, and especially in the hot summer sun and July, August, and that kind of stuff.
so technically, I think a yard that I can kind of, see in my head is on Newbridge, and I think you may know that one. They have most of it as, like drought-resistant little plants. It's not drought-resistant grass. It's little plants with most of it being mulch. And so that could ultimately be allowed in the yard, is 100% mulched with just little plants here and there. As long as they have the 2 trees.
It could be. Whenever I was drafting this code amendment that's before you today, when I was envisioning what a nice looking yard would look like, maybe there would be some planting areas ringed by rocks or limestone or whatever with some plantings in the middle, and then you have some trees and what have you, and it's a good mix of it. Now, to get into the nitty gritty on how much sod you have to have versus how many areas of mulch, that gets very, very detailed. So
I understand.
there's not a good way to manage that as far as I know.
Okay,
So-
that's why I'm just asking. So
Yeah,
technically, a
understood.
yard could, because they want no maintenance except for maybe, watering a little, a piece of lavender or something that's in their yard, here and there, and the rest of it's mulch. That's technically
But
allowed.
sometimes that's more maintenance.
Well, for some people, yes. Some people like gardening, they just don't like mowing. Okay. And let's see. All right, so we did research, so this is on page 9, B3. So no more than 50% of the critical root zone of a heritage tree shall be covered with impervious cover and no closer than 3 feet. And so we looked at this and we know that that makes it safe for a heritage tree. It doesn't need to be further out.
Yes, you do need to be very careful, especially, you need to be careful with any trees. Let me say
Right.
that. But because we have the 3 different tiers of tree protection, we have under 12 inches, you don't have to protect it necessarily or receive a special permit from the city. 12 to 25, you have to have permission from the planning department, and 25 plus, you have to have permission from y'all before you can remove a tree. But from a tree protection standpoint, the more you add impervious cover to an area, the less water, rainwater, or even runoff soaks into the ground.
Right.
And so, especially those very large and rare trees that we would consider heritage or specimen trees, we do absolutely want to limit how much impervious cover is near or underneath them for the same reason.
So we have researched and 50%
Yes.
is fine.
Alamo Heights has a really good landscape code. And so a lot of these larger updates that you see, we pulled directly from it, and it functions pretty well.
Okay. And thank you for clarifying that the Texas red oak is allowed, because that's what my 2 trees are. But for those of us who die every winter, why do we still allow for cedar to
The
be
juniper
planted?
ash. Or,
Just cedar deodora.
it's not the same thing as juniper ash. Juniper ash is the tree you see out in the hill country. That is the bane of everyone's existence in in December when their pollen goes crazy. And so, but there's a lot of different types of cedars, and it's not that.
It's not that. Okay.
Juniper ash or Juniperus virginiana, variants of the same common cedar that you see.
Okay, and I
hill
see that it
country.
says common cedar
Yeah.
by the side of that.
That's the
Okay,
one
there.
that we're
Not allowing, unless
so-
it affects the warbler.
So, and just so y'all know, the little asterisk next to that, under following the letter F in cottonwood, that is an addition that should be underlined. So I'm wondering, whenever we uploaded this to Granicus, there may have been some formatting issues.
Okay,
I want to make sure that y'all are aware of that. The statement Juniperus virginiana and Juniperus ashii, 25 caliper inches or larger, must follow the tree removal processes outlined in that section right there for the purpose of preserving golden cheek warbler habitat.
Okay.
That is a new aspect of it. And so is adding Arizona ash and cottonwood just above it.
Okay.
We have a new system we're working through, and so sometimes that causes a little bit of formatting stuff, issues.
Okay, and so, and this all falls, of course, this, if somebody already has St. Augustine, it is grandfathered, but if they want to change their sod, or, need to replace their sod, they need to be careful,
Yes.
in the future. And so I just want to put that out there if anybody's listening, because I know there's a lot of people out there who would prefer St. Augustine to Bermuda. I haven't figured out why, because I'm a Bermuda girl myself, but, it's no longer allowed, and so if you're replacing your sod, no more.
It needs to be native, drought resistant. Also, one other thing, section 8A through D is also being added. That's the prevention and control of the spread of oak wilt that you see on the screen there. Trying to see what else. Let's
And there's a
see.
certain time of the year that trees need to be pruned.
Yes.
Is that in, I didn't see that in here.
No, from a pruning perspective, we do rely on, because we can't police everybody. So someone wanting, a homeowner, a one-off homeowner wanting to do some pruning, they are gonna have to rely on, we're gonna have to trust that they do their research or they hire a professional to prune appropriately.
But can we maybe put like an asterisk under one of these, just this is the time of year, the proper time of year for tree pruning to hopefully withhold the oak wilt from happening. Just add that in there if somebody's reading this, so they know for sure.
It might be better to put a statement of something similar to the effect of pruning should be accounted for at an appropriate time of year per the Texas A&M Forest Service or something along
That's
those
fine,
lines.
something, yeah, just so that people understand that there's certain times of the year that helps prevent, when you're pruning, to help prevent oak wilt.
Maybe put a recommendation per tree, like, whatever, for red oak, pruning done, in the January through, whatever, and then kind of that stuff. The point, like I said earlier, making it easier for residents and developers, just, oh, okay. Will everybody adhere to that? Probably not, but we can get majority of people.
I think a majority of the people will. I think it goes back to the same idea as the Grow Green Guide is if we put a reference in there that people can find really easily, that way, because over time, as an organization like Texas A&M Forest Service gains knowledge, their recommendations get tweaked and they change a little bit. So I think as long as we do that, that would be my recommendation if we want something we want to add.
Yeah, especially as seasons are changing these days. I don't think we had a winter so much for maybe a week.
Let's see. Also, one more thing, 9A and B. We are adding that as well into the code, so. Yep. We're gonna try to make sure between, y'all seeing this tonight and also with council that is updated and we can get the resolve, so it's a lot more clear in terms of what we're adding, what we're taking away. So.
Yeah. Well, that was it for me. Thank you.
Anything? Okay. One question that I have is about the use of this guide. So if it says that all the installed plants and landscape materials shall follow this guide, if you plant something that's not here, what happens? Like, if I love tulips and I plant tulips in my yard, was someone going to send me a letter that says, shame, pay us this fine? Or how does that work? How do we enforce this?
So, regarding landscape code requirements, where we see the most conversation with residents or a developer is when someone's developing a Chick-fil-A or a warehouse or you name it. That's the core of what we see, right? So they'll go through there's this pretty typical process that we go through in a pre-development meeting. They'll ask all the setbacks, impervious cover, where they can put the building, how parking ratios, that kind of stuff. And then they talk about landscaping. And so we send them to our codes. And it's like, and when we make sure we tell them it has to be native Central Texas, that kind of stuff. Or someone calls in, John Smith wants to plant a tree in his yard, or he wants to plant some shrubs. And so then we bring him to this section of code. We don't have a lot of conversations otherwise with the community. We have a very large community. We also don't have a lot of staff. We don't have very much staff to go out policing it on our own. If there is somebody who is concerned about some landscaping being installed, it's usually they give us a shout. Shoot us an email or they give us a call, and then we check on it, and then we go and coordinate with that person just to check if they're being compliant with the code or not. In the event that they're not and they continue to do or violate the code, we have the $2,000 per offense requirement. That's a pretty standard section of code from the state of Texas for misdemeanor related items. I'm probably getting the legal jargon wrong, but that is one that it follows state law from a cost perspective. And if it escalates to that point where it has to come in front of our municipal judge, which is very rare. In fact, I don't think it's ever happened from a landscape code perspective in our city. Then the judge usually has the authority to either make them remove it and replace it with something else, or pay a portion of the fee, or all of it, depending on the severity of the issue. So.
Interesting.
Is there any way we can also maybe get with Lowe's, Home Depot, any of the other nurseries that we have within the city limits to, give them this guide to let them know what plants really aren't appropriate to try and sell within the city limits?
We can probably provide the documentation to them. We have to be careful, though. We cannot force them to limit sales, as far as I understand it, of certain things that are completely legal to sell in the state of Texas and the United
Right.
States. So.
And I understand that, especially because somebody from, say, Euland may come to Lowe's and
Right.
they're perfectly able to plant those plants. I'm just saying, you know, I don't know, just maybe having them, I don't know, put it, not, you know, at least have their staff trained, and if they say, well, I'm doing this in Kyle, well, you do know this is illegal, and this is not to be planted in Kyle. You know, somebody, at least some training on their part, or, you know, have the guide say, hey, you need to train your people on what can be put in Kyle, something like that.
I think, Commissioners, it's appropriate to keep in mind that this landscape is only, again, required landscaping. So your required shrubs, your required trees, your required sod. Anything they do outside, above, and beyond what is required would be an addition and would not be prohibited unless specifically listed. So for Chairman Unkin's question, so if you wanted to plant tulips and it's not recommended by the Green Grove Guide, it would not be a code violation unless you chose that as your required landscaping in your front yard. Then at that point, we would say no during the plan review process. We'd be glad to probably reach out to communications to share those changes with the community, with Lowe's and Home Depot, but I don't know that we would go as far as conducting training on what is, say, illegal or not legal. That kind of gets into an area of regulating a sales of a business that, and probably is not germane to this discussion, but that is something we can look at doing
Yeah,
if you're
just,
interested.
for example, somebody wants to replace their sod and they want to go and buy St. Augustine to do it, and, you know, we're recommending no, and, you know.
Augustine is prohibited. That would
Right,
be one,
exactly, and
yes.
but, you know, we want to make sure that Lowe's and Home Depot or any other nursery within the city limits, I'm not saying, you know, drive out to Buda, drive out to Euland or any other nursery, but just within the city limits, so that they know that, guess what, St. Augustine, a no-go here in the city. That way a person doesn't buy it and then go install it, and then somebody come by and go, you know, and now you
So-
have to take it out.
So we can inform the local businesses of what grass we allow and what grass we do not allow. We cannot require the local businesses to share that with their customers. That's actually a First Amendment issue.
Oh, okay.
Can we ask them to narc on people who buy the wrong stuff?
No.
Not that I would encourage that, I was just curious, from a legal perspective.
You know, you can put up signs, and, you know, there's that, those.
Yeah, that's up to them if they want to put up the sign,
Don't tread
but,
on me, but tread on me, but St. Augustine.
yeah. You know, we can just let them know, and what they want to do with that information, they can do with it.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, just,
Yeah.
the thought would be this, that in residential areas in particular, it's the HOAs that have a lockdown on these standards. And of course, that's where a lot of the wrangles go on within a local community and development, is with the HOA and the homeowners around these very things commonly. My take on that as a result is that we've got another big development going in the northwest, right? West, and we'll have others come as well, to get this done well as quickly as possible, so the developer, who is the HOA, in essence, in the beginning, shapes their entire model around this, and to do that as quickly as possible, because you don't have the staff to go out and police this, but if this is what's required and they conform, then it's their job actually to see that everybody plays the game. And so that's one thought I would have about really getting this to work with the new projects ASAP, because we'll have them coming at us. And so I would like to shape their behavior a little bit, give them a little nudge about the direction to go in. And maybe it will have an impact.
As well as the HOAs, you know, because like for ours, for example, you know, most of them have to have an architectural review committee. And that ARC at least reviews the front yard. They don't really, you know, some of the backyards can be done, but the front yards, as long as they know, and the person says, oh yeah, I want to put in St. Augustine, that ARC can deny it and say, no, you know, before it's even gone anywhere. Now, here's the one thing, do most homeowners actually, apply to the ARC and get that done? Nah, not so much, but, but at least that's another location too, is to get with the HOAs and let them know about it as well. Once it's finalized and the right colors are done.
Well, if we get this model out there, this new ordinance, and with some guidance to them, it seems like we could have these newer developments be the exemplars for what should be done. In other words, if you want to see what something can look like, go to this development, which is one of the first, and look at it. So we don't have to create anything special, dummy up a sim for the computer or anything. We can say, look at what's going on over there. And I would like to use the, newborn communities, you might say, as the exemplars for everybody that's following. And maybe save all of us a lot of work, actually.
Any other questions? Okay, so we would need a motion and a second to make a recommendation on this action. Does anyone want to make one?
I'd like to make a motion to recommend approval of this to the city council.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion to recommend approval of 4.3 from Commissioner Shield and a second by Commissioner Serrato. Is there any discussion on this before we vote?
Madam Chair?
Yes.
I've looked at this a couple times and listened to all of the discussion. The statement that xeriscaping, a landscaping method, is required in all zoning districts, I think will be really hard to enforce. I understand the intent, and we want to encourage landscaping. I think the part that really has teeth is taking away that no more than 75%. That's actually what you might call structural change to the document. But I'm not convinced that worded the way it is, it's enforceable. How can you enforce a method? It only means that you'd have to look at every plan and come up with some sort of standards as to percentage of rock and percentage of mulch and so forth. And so I don't think I can go along with this because it just doesn't, I don't think it's enforceable. So.
Just a question for you.
Yeah.
Commissioner Laurie, is it because it's not prescriptive enough then?
Yeah, exactly correct. Yeah, it's not prescriptive enough. So all of our other requirements say specific number of trees, specific amount of rock, and so forth. But to say that we're going to require a landscaping method is not definitive enough. And without additional documentation, I understand it's a principle, but we can't enforce a principle like that, I don't think. So I would like to send it back for rewording, or to strike that paragraph F, to have that is required under the following conditions. I don't even know why that part's there, but I think the idea is there are certain things that we're going to require, and it's types of grasses and amount of rock and amount of trees, and I'm not sure how we get the point across is that xeriscaping is what we want, but I don't think this is enforceable. Maybe our legal counsel could weigh in on that, but anyway, that's my opinion. And so I would offer, I don't have the wording, unfortunately, to say what it should be, but I don't think it should be that. Anybody else care to weigh in? And
Well, in terms of how these things, no pun intended, hit the ground, I think that this idea, trying to get after the idea of a tree/landscape supervisor for projects, is one way that we articulate exactly what we want and hold them accountable at that point. Now, that's all with new development, obviously. But I think that's one way you work with that, where it's not so prescriptive, there's some flexibility, it can be done on a consultation basis, but in the end, they know that they have to conform to the outlines here in the code. And I think that we can be in a situation where it's so overly prescriptive that you could argue about subspecies of a species, that is required. So I very much appreciate your concerns here, but as you can see, I'm sort of looking at it from a different viewpoint in terms of the behavior involved to get it done, and creating exemplars of what we want, and then using people, holding them accountable very clearly for their projects. That's probably the way we best get it done. It's on a collaborative consultancy basis rather than prescriptive, and we get into a relationship with people that's, more about coercion than collaboration.
Well, for me, it's more about definition. So let me use an example of a water feature, like a fountain or something like that. If we say it must be xeriscaped, does a water feature fit into that mix or no?
A water feature can fit into xeriscaping. You do have to be careful about when it's implemented and when you're going to use it. For example, if it's a fountain that's pulling from city water, we would have to say, okay, as long as our water restrictions are allowing you to use it. If it is a trying to think in terms of a rain garden, if you will, where it has plants that can survive in both wet conditions and dry conditions, and it's a depression, and it's used to hold water before it runs off site and also clarify the water at the same time. That's also a water feature, but it's one that's cyclical from the time of year, right? So those are things that we already account for in terms of our code. We have a drought management and water usage program already in place in terms of if it's not raining enough versus if it is, how often you can water your lawn every day or water your shrubs, if you can use a system or if you can only hand water. We already account for that. So by percentage of turf on the ground, for example, I don't have a good number because each site is unique, and it's a cohesive design. That's the idea. Is you have so many shrubs, you have so many trees, you have so much turf, and some species of turf work better under shade and some don't. So you have to require a percentage of that per se is gets really, really nuanced. And I don't want to say, I think pigeonholed is the wrong word, but whereas, for example, we are comfortable with the idea for a maximum percentage of the river rock, because river rock, stone, or material similar to that, they actually they absorb heat really well, and so that can affect the adjacent plants in a negative fashion, especially in hot summer months. They can turn them brittle, and they can burn them, not in the sense of catching them on fire necessarily, but they can cause damage to the plants and add to the heat island effect. So we have to be careful about when someone's coming in and they're saying, okay, we're wanting to put a landscape plan together, then we start having discussions with them about that.
Okay, thanks, Will.
Yes, sir.
Is that where, putting in a template or a reference, like some pictures, just like, oh, something like that, but where it's not 40%, has to be Texas sage or something like that, but just providing an example that, look at this front yard, and I'm sure we have some examples here throughout Kyle that would, that can be using that as a sort of as a go by that, if you want to, maybe kind of look like this. Not necessarily, copy and paste, but something similar.
Echoing on what Commissioner Mata said, I do think it would be great to have some visual guides to help people with this, because when I prepared for the meeting and I Googled xeriscape, I saw a lot of rocks. I saw a lot of things that did not look like what we are trying to go for here. So I know that the default approach for a lot of people nowadays, myself included, is Google things. And if we have the ability to put some kind of resource together that either showcases things already here in the community or shows good examples in other areas about what it is we're trying to do to give people inspiration or some visual cues to go off of, I think that would be really helpful. And if there's a way for the city to make sure that it ends up at the top of the list, if people Google that within our geographic area, I think that would be even more helpful, but I don't know how to do that. That's above my pay grade.
The last bit, we can't control on how Google algorithms work. But there's at least from a commercials perspective, there's a couple of examples that come to mind offhand. The TXB store, it's xeriscaped. So when you see that, you can drive by, that's an example of it. The Costco is xeriscaped. Trying to think what else. Those are two examples of xeriscaping for Central Texas native plants. And we'd have to go looking for single-family residential versions of that. But at the same time, we're trying to avoid a template that someone has to comply with at the same time, which when it comes to design, we want to give people the license to be artistic in their design and also be compliant at the same time. So it is difficult to, from a code perspective, to put that into a box, if you will, and enforce a certain type of design other than general, you have to xeriscape and no more than 25% of rock on the site. We already know they have to have a minimum of, for a single family, 2 trees and 6 shrubs on site. And they have to have ground cover over the entire site. That's not driveway or sidewalks. So if we include some visual examples of existing stuff in town that are good examples of what we're looking for, that might go a fair distance from that perspective.
That, and then having a list of, not every plant or shrub or tree, but just something as an example, choose from the following. And I know it's referenced in the guide, but just having it, right there, it's like, oh, okay, it gives you an idea. Oh, yeah, I might use some sage or whatever. But just something right there.
Understood.
Any more discussion on this motion?
What would it take to drop in language about there being a person taking point, being a tree protection / landscape supervisor? What would it take to drop that in there to make it have an impact on the document and be useful? Assuming anybody would be interested in that, but.
I think just making a statement as part of your recommendation vote, it's stating, in letting us put that in an appropriate manner, just stating generally, we want to amend the section where it talks about tree supervisors to include other landscaping as well. And we can account for that accordingly and kind of wordsmith that to make it effective, more and more effective.
Okay. In that case, then, we have a motion on the floor, do we not?
We do, yep.
If you want to amend that and make an amendment motion, you can.
Yes, I would like to offer an amendment that we use the language of tree protection / landscape supervisor for developments be used in this document.
Landscape, what was it?
It's in the document, there's the tree protection supervisor.
Uh-huh.
This would be like tree protection /
Landscape.
landscape supervisor. So somebody's taking point for and responsibility for its implementation.
And I'll second that.
Okay, we have an amendment to add language around tree protection plus landscape supervisor from Commissioner Stiegel and seconded by Commissioner Shield. Any discussion on that one? I don't think it's necessary. I probably won't vote for that. When I read about the tree protection supervisor, they have very clear jobs and very clear accountability that they're supposed to have. The person must demonstrate knowledge in the area of tree protection practices during construction and be on site to ensure the measures are enforced. I don't know what they would do for just the landscape in general, as far as, I guess they could make sure that the wrong stuff isn't getting planted, but the city is already going to be doing that when they're approving the landscape plan. So I don't know what they would be
Well, my
doing.
concern is that developers have their own thoughts. They move at their own speeds. Both are usually different than ours. And it would be good to have somebody accountable on site to know these standards and be able to work with their landscape planners to be quite clear about what goes in. Because if you look at the way developments go in, you know, we have to, before occupancy is approved, right, they have to have everything down. But I've seen that goes badly because they put down the necessary sod and plants to get the occupancy permit, but it is less than slipshod. And as a result, I've seen ruined yards due to flooding. Plants die really rather quickly. And I think they just need to be held accountable, some particular party, for the developers in particular, that can be responsible to us. And if the trees certainly are enough to protect, if we're going to implement anything as broad as this, and I think very important as this, we ought to hold the developers responsible. It's that simple for me. It's not a perfect world, but I think if you have one phone number that staff can call and say, we saw a problem or it's been reported to, there's a problem over at X site in your development, then that's an easy phone call rather than letting it all go. That's just my view on it. Again, this is more about shaping behavior than being prescriptive. It's more about not letting there be any real loose ends here. Somebody's got to be accountable. This can be really amorphous, and we look, what are we looking at? What are we get, you know, there's a lot of plants and this and that. Yes, and they should be familiar with them and know how they're used and work with their landscape planner to implement the plans that meet our standards. And I think somebody should take point on that.
But how do you make sure that you have someone who's capable of
They're
doing that?
working with their own landscape architects. They have their own landscape planners. So the question is somebody on site that's overseeing its proper implementation and is accountable to us?
I'll give an example just from my experience. So KB, who built the house, yes, they had, you know, they told their landscapers they needed this, 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 and this in each of the yards. But they contracted out to an actual person to put in the sod and put in the trees. And matter of fact, KB told me, oh, Tracy, you can call them and tell them exactly what you want to have put in. And so I called them, said, I want red oaks, I want this type of bush, and I want these type of plants. And they balked. Oh, no, we can put in whatever we want. And I was like, no, this is what I was told by KB, and this is what I want in my yard. And so they gave me a little bit of hee-haw, but they did do it. But it was, they were gonna put in whatever they wanted to that day. And, you know, KB's already had everything signed off pretty much, because they didn't plant those until I had already bought the house. So, I bought it, I closed on Friday, they didn't put in the sod and everything until Tuesday. And so KB had already washed its hands, it was closed, it was done. And so the landscapers, you know, could have put in whatever they wanted, because it was cheaper for them at the time. You know?
And there's where I think the developer needs to be held accountable for what their subs do. And in the end, they're the ones who hired them. And that's really the kind of problem that I have seen before, and what I would like to address by holding them more accountable with perhaps a position like this.
I hear what both of you are saying, and I'm sorry about that
Yeah,
situation
yeah,
with your
yeah,
house. I don't see this as a job for the city. You know, if you have a private contractor who's doing work on behalf of you, it's not the city's job to go and tell the contractor or the subcontractor that you did it wrong. You should be responsible for your own business and for your own people that you hire. So I don't know, I just have a hard time codifying that into a city ordinance that every single landscape activity that happens in the city through this code has to have one of those people there.
Well, it wouldn't be everybody. And what I'm talking about time and again is developers in particular, where you can have your greatest leverage and your greatest impact overall. That would be, and the example Commissioner Shield gave is a great one, and the kind of thing I've seen again and again. And I think that is one means to hold them accountable. There's one person to communicate with in that development. It's got 1,000 homes going in, and they're responsible. And they're responsible until they literally legally can walk away from a property and say it's done in somebody else's hands. So I'm not suggesting that this is, somebody has to go out and hire a supervisor if they're redoing their yard in that particular case. But I think the world is a complicated place, and you would think yards, we're spending a lot of time talking about yards, but there's a reason. And people like to go home and maybe mow their yard and feel strained doing that. They don't want to make a lot of choices about their environment in terms of who they pick to do everything. People move in, and I know of a case where somebody moved in and was shocked that that big lot behind them, wooded lot, became a convenience store and gas station. Now, if you'd surveyed that area, you knew it was commercial. And if you're buying that property, you were going to have something literally in your backyard. People buy these homes without thinking the consequences through and do not follow that chain of supervision. They don't know who to hold accountable. And so I think that on behalf of citizens, actually, and in the larger picture of developing xeriscaping here, we ought to go forward with this, as I suggested, with having a supervisor who can be responsible for both tree protection and landscaping. So that motion's on the floor, so I guess we can just do with it as we wish.
Yep. Is there any other discussion on that amendment? Okay, so let's go ahead and take a vote on that amendment. If you're in favor of amending the language to have both a tree protection and landscape supervisor, please say aye.
Aye.
If you're opposed, say nay. Nay? Okay, motion passes 4 to 2. Thank you. Okay, so our motion is now to recommend approval of 4.3 to the city council with the amendment. Any discussion on that motion? Okay, all those in favor, please say aye.
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 All opposed, say nay. Okay, that motion carries. Which brings us, thank you, Mr. Atkinson.
Thank you.
That brings us to item number 5, adjournment. You had to point that at me, didn't you? Yeah.
And I covered it.
As we've completed all the items on the meeting's agenda, there's no further business that can be discussed, so we are adjourned at 7:38 PM.